Hello. We're very fortunate to have with us today Harris Solomon. He is an assistant professor in cultural anthropology and global health at Duke University. He's a very freshly minted PhD, 2011. He studies the connections between body, its environments, and longevity in India, specifically in the context of chronic illness in Mumbai. His work is at the intersections of medical anthropology, South Asian studies, science and technology studies, global health, and food studies. His research examines what he calls, quote, the embodied politics of accumulation, a wonderful phrase. And he's currently working on a book called Out of Proportion, Food, Fat, and the Elements of Illness in India. It examines the relationships forged between food, fat, the body, and the city in light of India's rising rates of obesity and diabetes. This draws on a really impressive range of Mumbai settings, home kitchens, metabolic disorder clinics, as well as food companies. So a real range from what might have been seen as a very kind of traditional ethnographic sites of home kitchens, all the way up to corporate food centers. So a really impressive range. The aim of this study is to better understand what has been termed India's diseases of prosperity. So these are the diseases that come up moving from infectious to chronic diseases as countries get more wealthy. His work has been supported by really the whole range of fellowships from so Fulbright Hayes, National Science Foundation, Wenner-Gren, as well as American Institute of Indian Studies. His talk today is called 23 Globesity and the Accumulative Body in India. I'm very curious what the 23 is going to be about. I hope you are too. So please join me in welcoming Harris Solomon.
Thanks for that introduction, Matt, and thanks, Farina, as well. And just like to express my gratitude to the center, and it's wonderful to see such a packed schedule and lots of activity going on, and just to be here in general. And thanks for coming out on a snowy day. This is my kind of winter. I also have to say I'm a little scared about the ratings cards. I kind of feel like a chef at it feels a little Top Chef-like, this is Restaurant Wars. So I hope this works and is tasty. My email is there, and I'm trying to work through some bigger arguments in the context of the talk itself. So I am really grateful for your feedback, and hope we have time to talk afterwards. Okay, so the title, again, is 23 Globesity and the Accumulative Body in India. So scales anchor many lessons about the power of numbers. Anna Tsing, for example, considers scale as a means to critique celebratory globalisms. Scale, quote, is the spatial dimensionality necessary for a particular kind of view, up close or from a distance, microscopic or planetary, she writes. Put differently, scale can magnetize or distance us from a problem. Scales and their enumeration also suffuse the ethnography of public health conditions. I don't want that. I definitely don't want my email. There we go. That's what we want. Scales and their enumeration also suffuse the ethnography of public health conditions, and their ubiquity raises questions about what precisely is doing the magnetic work of an emergent public health problem. Since 2007, I've been studying the rise of chronic disease in India, specifically obesity and diabetes. This broader project considers the intimacies between food, fat, bodies, and environments. According to dominant public cultural accounts, by the late 1990s, urban Indians were increasingly enjoying the comforts of middle-class life, and yet there was an embodied, ironic punchline. They were enjoying too much and becoming heavier and sicker as a result. Accumulation, it seemed, was a tenuous process wrought through the vital substances of food and fat. And yet there was no clear causal agent for this supposed mass malady, no single germ to speak of. The most common agent in many accounts of blame was consumerism, painted as an urban middle-class lifestyle of indulgences and sedentarism, sparked by the country's economic reforms in the early 1990s. In newspapers, on television, and in everyday conversations, debates about chronic disease trafficked in concepts like globesity and affluenza, and mobilized contemporary genetic logics and critiques of middle-class consumption. Many of these debates construed the diet as an occasion for moral and biomedical intervention. So in this context, my research maps how, at what scales, and in which forms do persons, food, fat, ideals of health and the city emerge together in relation. At the nexus of these forms is the composition of what I call metabolic life. By metabolic life, I mean a condition of vitality realized through connective permeability. In this framework, what is at stake is less the generalizable whole objects of food and the body as such. Rather, I'm interested in the relational constituencies that make up these wholes, in what Karen Barad has called the diffraction patterns of intra-action that are, she says, the patterns of difference that make a difference. These patterns of metabolic life are recognizable across several domains, and certainly biomedicine is one of them. Increasingly, clinicians and bioscientists alike consider conditions of relative health and sickness in terms of metabolic balance or imbalance. This is a story of hormones, proteins, and epigenetic flickers, in which the infinitive form to metabolize goes beyond the digestive system to include how the body processes therapeutic drugs or how it experiences surges in neurotransmitters. But this is not always a story of returning to homeostasis, nor is it always a story of the body as a single, holistic, impenetrable object of concern. Sensorial stimuli, food, and environmental toxins belong to the domain of the metabolic as well, prompting us to think about life's risks in terms of exposure, to follow Hannah Landecker's suggestion. These compositional substances bridge the organic and the inorganic, the manufactured and the heritable, and the agential and the incidental. What they share is their possibility for absorption, which is the critical mechanism of metabolic life. I suggest that metabolic life and its enactments through absorption is a productive place for ethnographers to consider questions of material ontology and how to take care in materializing that world, as Barad directs us. In my paper today, I'd like to examine how metabolic life specifically registers as measurable, that is, how it scales across different connective intensities of fatness and pathology. This is because the entanglements that I witnessed between persons, substances, city spaces, desires, risks, and the realization of bodily states often hinged on matters of being porous or not. Being porous, or porosity, meant not only identifying with, but also coexisting with and incorporating a range of elements that constituted food and what we might call the environment. The home kitchen opened to new types of packaged foods, moving women into differential relations with groups that processed that food, be they everyday criminal outfits behind food adulteration scams or food companies behind new healthy snacks. Mumbai streets, marked by xenophobic political violence, were porous to a geographically variant range of street foods, that could satisfy any vernacular culinary desire. And I mention these two examples to gesture to how metabolic life emerges outside of medicalization, as much as it can emerge within the context of health and medicine, and at its margins as well. There's also a lot to say about the concept of the metabolism within the social sciences itself, its deployment in anthropology, and its deployment in South Asian studies historically from 20th century onwards, and I'm happy to talk more about that, as well as the sort of recent revitalization of food as a place to think about material ontology in certain philosophies of the material. Happy to talk about that in the discussion. But my broader aim today is to nudge discussions about both chronic disease causality and the constitution of urban Indian sociality away from the magnetic theme of consumption. This coda of consumption is important, but in the context of obesity, its analytic centrality risks narrowing everything to a Newtonian equal opposite ping between transitions to middle-class prosperity and the emergence of fat as something harmful. I argue that in contrast to consumption, or perhaps in addition to consumption, life also emerges through absorption. Moments of absorption point us to exchanges between bodily systems and environmental toxins, subjectivities and the intensities of city life, such as stress, and the blockages between guts and nutrients in the cases of malnutrition, whether under or over nutrition. Developing this point is not intended to deny the rise of chronic illness in India or elsewhere, to deny or attest to or put on a seesaw balance of the attendant levels of chronic malnutrition that are pervasive in the background and in the foreground in this study, and the very real suffering that both cause. So part of what I'd like to do here is to try to move away from the under-over seesaw. So as Bruno Latour notes, critique has lost its legs because it does not compose. In that spirit, rather than deconstruction, I want to explore the possibilities and limits of what the presence and absence of fat makes evident in moments of measurement. But to do so, the cultural figures of the housewife binging on barfi, like you see here, and the malnourished child must be understood in terms that are reticular, not binary. In discussing the composition of obesity in India, in a moment where socio-medical explanations strike me as hewing quite closely to narratives of economic transition, I'd like to instead tread very carefully around transitions. Transitions, writes Katherine Malibu, are theoretical fissures. Problematically, she writes, they are not recognized as such and run the risk of being overwhelmed by brute, naive ideology. So in my paper today, I want to pose 23, the cutoff point numerically between normal and overweight on the new Indian body mass index, as one such theoretical fissure, and to describe how it works as a site of composition and a site for us to grapple with the different operations of accumulation and absorption. Put differently, when bodies on the scale come together into bodies of national and transnational evidence, what precisely composes obesity in India? Here, I use Bruno Latour's agile notion of composition, which for Latour, quote, underlines that things have to be put together while retaining their heterogeneity. So in this manner, I'll first discuss the phenomenon of globesity, which is a word amalgamation of the words globalization and obesity, which describes a trend of weight gain along west to east channels of cultivated prosperity, and which circulates through both academic and popular discourses within and outside of India. I'll then move on to discuss the development of a new body mass index, or BMI, especially for South Asians. Indian biomedical experts designed this BMI scale to be distinct from Western measurements. In relating different measures of metabolic life gone awry, what I'm interested in is their common concern with a generalized, holistic, comparable Indian body and its relative openness to the elements of the world. That is, how metabolic life ultimately becomes measured through fat. As with most public health estimates, the numbers framing the prevalence of obesity and diabetes in India vary incredibly widely. National surveys estimate that 15% of Indian women are obese, a third of whom are said to live in cities, and that 12% of Indian men are obese, up to a quarter of whom are said to be urban residents. Between 8 and 20% of Indians living in urban areas are said to have type 2 diabetes, and for the state of Maharashtra, in which I do my fieldwork in Mumbai, 6 million people are said to have type 2 diabetes. Of course, it's quite difficult to parse trends from these data. Regional variations are incredibly vast. Social class inflects nutritional status in complex and interactive ways. And in the case of the obesity estimates, the 2005-2006 National Family Health Survey was the first to estimate overweight status for men and women. So there's no sort of time series to work through here. There's also the complexity of cofactors that shuttle between symptoms that ultimately get labeled as diabetes or type 2 diabetes and those that get labeled as obesity. So the symptomatology in terms of its labeling is shared. And they often share similar types of clinical treatment by diabetologists or now metabolic disease specialists. Given this ambiguity, the government of India has proposed testing blood sugar levels in a national surveillance effort. In this space of calculated uncertainty, quantifying the problem has become what Jean Komaroff calls a medicament, a clash between public health officials, pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, health activists, and I would add in the context of this topic of study, weight loss companies and nutrition companies, over the comparative merit and urgency of the issue. This medicament has taken shape as a national alarm sounded through numbers, as India is said to lead the world with the greatest number of diabetics, and there is concern that the association between obesity and diabetes portends something even worse. The usual suspects of weight loss companies and health advice columnists, of course, have stepped in to help. So this is a common sort of something that circulates through newspapers. Here, teeny tiny tips for reducing obesity. And then from weight loss companies, which have become quite big in not only in cities, but in tier 2 metros as well. This is the English translation of, I can't wear my favorite salwar kameez because of my big tummy. But even Baba Ramdev, guru to many, offers Motapa ke liye yoga for obesity. The very existence of diseases of prosperity in India, I would argue itself is a scale-making project. I find myself uncomfortably called upon by my epidemiologist colleagues, for example, to stake a claim as to whether these diseases are or are not at an epidemic scale, or sometimes amongst my South Asianist colleagues, whether this is all really a matter of middle classness, a disease that defines itself cleanly along lines of class. Epidemic enumeration, after all, flops a sheaf of certainty onto the policy table, and in India, that table is not terribly even when it comes to matters of nutrition policy. In terms of the sensational instances of obesity's epidemic invocation, one emerged early on the April 2006 cover of the national magazine India Today, picturing an apple with a measuring tape wrapped around it, accompanied by the headline, "Girth of a Nation." The lead-in for the feature article noted, if urban India is getting richer, it is getting fatter too, but the path to prosperity is not paved with good health and cheer, warn medics. Experts say that India may be facing a fat tsunami. And I would also just point out here, this is 2006. So the very invocation of tsunami very, very soon after the Indian Ocean tsunami is, I think, quite notable. The article made clear obesity's entanglements in India. It went on to say, quote, although in the West is associated with poverty, in the developing world, it is a problem for the new rich. Simply put, the once familiar image of India as a land of poverty, hunger, malnutrition, scarcity, and famine has been turned on its head. While it may once have made fat respectable, the new liberated economic growth has clearly left more food on India's plate than it can healthily handle. End quote. Yet, the India Today story was not the first major news outlet to express concern about the rising rates of chronic disease in the country. In April 2004, Newsweek humor columnist Andy Borowitz wrote a fake news story entitled U.S. Outsources Obesity to India, Supersizing Now Rampant in Bangalore. Using images of Indian call center workers enjoying all-you-can-eat buffets, Borowitz was after a laugh at the idea that the U.S. could shed its own excess weight via circuits of transnational service labor, invoking images of call center workers going for all-you-can-eat breadsticks at the Olive Garden. It's a long, very worth quoting article, but I'll just give a bit here. Quote Borowitz, the United States is rapidly outsourcing obesity to India and hopes to shed as many as 3 trillion pounds of unsightly cellulite annually, was the headline of this satire. This contrived story was actually remarkably prescient in its presumptions about the embodied effects of transcontinental capital flows. 4 years later, in May 2008, U.S. President George W. Bush explained to an economic roundtable convened in Missouri that Indians were eating more than expected. His comments were designed to elaborate and to quell the political flames of Condoleezza Rice's earlier public statement that the improvement in Indian diets factored into seemingly sudden high global food prices. Bush changed the tenor of the story from obstacle to opportunity. American businesses could profit from this problem, he said, because in places like India, quote, there turns out to be prosperity, and such prosperity increases demand, and by extension, demand for American meat businesses. Bush explained that, quote, when you start getting wealth, you start demanding better nutrition and better food, and so demand is high, and that causes prices to go up. These comments did not go unnoticed in the Indian media, resulting in headlines such as, adding insult to injury, Bush says starving India eats too much. Several Indian reports fumed that this spotlight on the Indian middle class silenced the troubling trend of an actual decrease in food consumption among India's poor, even after decades of promise of uplift of neoliberal reforms. The New York Times reported Indian reactions to Bush's remarks by interviewing economic commentator Pradeep Mehta, who replied that, quote, many hungry people in sub-Saharan Africa would find food on their plates if Americans weighed more like middle-class Indians. Mehta suggested that Americans consider giving money they would otherwise spend on liposuction over to famine relief efforts instead. Days after Bush's comments, a cartoon in the city newspaper, the Mumbai Mirror, depicted an overweight American couple touring the streets of an Indian city, indignant at an emaciated pair of men on the roadside eating garbage. No wonder we're having food shortages in the States, one of them exclaims. These guys in India have been eating way too much. The emaciation of curbside and animal and human bodies, and the invocation of a trade-off between liposuction and food assistance offer striking commentaries on the fluid exchange between substances of fat and money, a transmutation between adipose and cash. Both local and internationally syndicated media often used Globesity to name both the epidemic itself and its mechanisms of action. The whole world is falling obese, said an article from BBC's Hindi news service in 2007. Obesity was painted as a global mahamari, a global epidemic that had reached India, wrote the Navbharat Times. English news outlets wrote about obesity in epidemic terms with a similar tone. One said, as India's economy grows, so does the temptation for many people to eat more and do less. The term globesity appears in most of these accounts, some referencing a document prepared by the World Health Organization in the year 2000 as the original source of the term. To the best of my ability, that is one of the original sources of the term. The Globesity narrative depicts a new appetite spreading to malleable bodies of the global south, said to have their hunger for modernity matched only by an irresistible desire for calorie-dense foods. In its extension to India, it first poses a moral imperative that Indians should not gain weight, and that if Indians do indeed gain weight, the result is the comparative embodiment of irony and surfaces a puzzle to be solved. Here, fat can prove something about the relationship between new socio-political environments and embodied histories, what Anna Kirkland has termed fat Orientalism. Here, a story of risk emerges in terms of a body that accumulates, the accumulative body. As Globesity discourses would have it, the body at stake in the rise of obesity accumulates new prosperity, becomes sick, and marks the underbelly of the urban middle-class fantasy. The additive terms of this body's accumulation fix Globesity's second assumption into place. Secondly, that Indian bodies are comparable to Western bodies only through what they add, unwise food choices and excessive sedentarism. Faced with the accumulative body of Globesity, we are challenged to find a smoking gun for fatness that can be steeped in optimism about transnational bodily commonality and relatively silent on local biologies. This vision of chronic illness encapsulates bodies rendered materially similar by their shortcomings. If miseducated consumption leads to illness, it is only individual willpower dedicated to health that can reduce body weight in this matter. Appeals to Globesity assert that given enough metal, individuals can manage bodily threats through measured biomedical reason and personal responsibility. Globesity, as an inactive pattern, also sets into these bodies into temporal relations through claims about causality, that which moves disease forward, and about therapy, that which can push disease back. This is the chronic in Globesity's version of chronic disease, its ontological and epistemological grounds. However, the measurement of Indian body fat has a long medical history worth exploring. To take but one example, in 1859, British Assistant Surgeon General Dr. W.G. Donne wrote a case study about a very remarkable example of perverted nutrition in Bombay for The Lancet. In his report, entitled Remarkable Case of Obesity in a Hindu Boy Aged 12 Years, Donne included an engraving that he wrote as a very good representation of a photograph known in the streets of a boy known in the streets of Bombay under the sobriquet of the Fat Boy. Donne recounted the story of the 12-year-old boy named Shakarm, who, quote, lives on the bounty of the many charitable citizens of Bombay. In his second year, he has become very fat, and the obesity has increased with his growth year by year till his whole body is now encased in an immense mass of solid adipose tissue, which hangs in pendulous folds over his chest and hips and the flexures of his limbs. Donne noted that Shakarm enjoys excellent health, has a moderately good appetite, and lives chiefly on dal and rice. Donne also said he had no complaint whatsoever, except a difficulty of breathing when he subjects himself to any rigorous exercise. Historian Sandra Gilman, in writing about the Hindu boy obesity case study, notes that Dr. Donne's invocation of the fat boy is likely a reference to the character of Fat Joe, also known as the Fat Boy, in Charles Dickens's 1836 book Pickwick Papers. But I'd add that there's more to Donne's investigation than mere culture jamming. Donne measured Shakarm's weight at 206 pounds, his height at 48.5 inches, and he also provided measurements relating the girth of the boy's chest, abdomen, thigh, calf, arm, and foot. Shakarm's is the measured body, as much as his is the body of curiosity and excess. Similarly, literary accounts offer contrasting genealogies of a body digesting measures of power and wealth into fat, and these visions do not necessarily feature illness centrally. So for example, fatness has marked apex positions of the Jajmani system of resource distribution in Indian villages, where high caste landowners preside over relationships with ritual-providing Brahmins and lower caste peasants. The caste inflections of fatness appear often in literature as well as popular lore. One example, Bengali author Mashavita Devi, in her fictional story The Hunt, describes a chilly interchange between a tribal woman named Mary and her employer, the landowning Mrs. Prasad, whom Devi describes as lardy. And it's later in the story where Mary overcomes the fatness of Mrs. Prasad. That's the enactment of the sort of subaltern agency that where a thin tribal woman is able to overcome fatness. It's important to point out here how the excesses of powerful bodies were inflected by their porosity to transnational exchange and gendered social orders across several historical moments. Fatness cultivated through profit in India moved transnationally through the men of the British Empire and its subjects, as in the case of the character Joseph Sedley in William Thackeray's Vanity Fair. Thackeray explains that Sedley's weight gained during his time in India, quote, caused Joseph much anxious thought and alarm. Now and then he would make a desperate attempt to get rid of his superabundant fat, but his indolence and love of good living speedily got the better of his endeavors at reform, and he found himself again at 3 meals a day. Historian Lizzie Collingham notes that Sedley is the typical Nabab, the 19th century caricature of an East India Company servant who returns to England enriched by his time in India, a man, according to Collingham, quote, neither British nor Indian, but a particular blend of the two, identifiable by his dry yellow skin, his liver complaint, and his consequent biliousness, and his propensity to drink large quantities of wine and eat copious dinners. Sounds nice. Here, the alimentary assimilation of India composes a post-colonial hybrid of masculinized hunger and the machine of colonialism, quite the cyborg, in Donna Haraway's terms, a particular blend, indeed. This blend cues us to the complex articulations that make up just some of the many histories of fatness in India and the degrees of porosity they demand, some in relationship to health and illness and many not. If literary and historical attachments between fatness, wealth, power, and gender selectively materialize through the land-owning Mahajan or the gluttonous Nabab, their present-day incarnation in public culture have extended the risk of excess weight to a much more generalized population, while simultaneously marking it, the problem, as a medical one. Within this risk lies the possibility for gross weight gain and moral failing on account of poor self-care. Current films and television still make the Fat Tycoon an enduring stock character, but today's Mahajan is expected to exercise as much as he is to receive rubdowns. For example, in the 2009 Hindi film 42 Kilometer, 42 Kilometers, includes among its central characters a rich, chubby businessman who must slim down and run a marathon at the insistence of his investors. The character was based on the multi-billionaire tycoon Anil Ambani, chairman of the Reliance Anil Dhirubhai Ambani Group, whose subsidiary companies reach into India's public media, telecommunications, electricity, health, insurance, and finance infrastructures. Ambani told a television interviewer the film was a documentary true to his own life. It's not really a documentary, but it's portrayed as a documentary of his own life. That fine line, right? 0 dark 30. Years before, when he was visibly overweight, one of his investors asked him, "How can we trust you with our money when you cannot even take care of your own health?" Ambani and the film character began assiduously dieting and running, eventually competing in the Mumbai Marathon, 42 kilometers marathon, and reestablishing faith in the corporation via faith in the body of the CEO. So the moral force in the story here is not that Ambani would eat into the profits hungrily as a greedy Mahajan, but rather that his hardened character, too open to food, but not open enough to self-discipline, rendered him unable to govern. The point here is that the capacity to absorb, the power of metabolic life, manifests at different scales of attachment and thus has varying limits. Consider, for another example, this preview for the Indian version of The Biggest Loser, called in India Biggest Loser Jitega, or literally The Biggest Loser Wins. Move the mic.
यजमान तैयारी करो यजमान आगे है शगुन का सामान हाँ
मनोरमा
राहु अड़ गया नेकलेस जकड़ गया मंगल भारी अंगूठी नहीं जा रही बाजू बन छोटा मिला शादी का न्योता ग्रहों के साथ साथ ये कन्या भी है भारी ये रिश्ता हो गया कुछ दिनों बाद
अब मनोरमा लगे है प्यारी अति सुंदर.
So in this ad, the priest rushes in to announce to the household to get ready for Manorama's wedding. The bridal trousseau has arrived. The song then narrates tight-fitting elements of the trousseau, using wordplays on astrological bad omens. So she has heavy planets, as much as she is heavy herself. As visually we see that the proper objects simply don't fit on Manorama's fleshy body. Therefore, the bridal body must open up to boot camp to properly accept these objects and to open herself to the demands of fair skin and thinness as her fat magically disappears. In her porosity, Manorama opens this space of opportunity for the show's contestants to lose weight as well. And it's very well worded because she says as she's crying, I only have a couple days to get ready. What should I do? And it's a preview for the new season of the television show as well. News outlets extended these very morals beyond the provenance of the super rich into more ordinary life worlds, primarily by associating accumulation with key cultural figures in deeply gendered terms. This began with housewives, whom news stories suggested gain weight because they spend the day, quote, in 24/7 idle domesticity, have a traditional homebound nature, and tend to snack more often and eat leftovers of other family members. Also at risk were working women for whom, quote, work pressure and deadlines have led them to skip meals and go for junk food. This is especially said to be the case for women living in urban settings, whose laziness, one journalist suggested, stems from their access to home appliances that made them unwilling to look after themselves. Regardless of the proposed theory, a common figure circulated is that 2 out of 3 women in Mumbai are overweight, based on an epidemiological study of nearly 4,600 women in 4 regions of India that then gets mapped onto Maharashtra and then onto Mumbai itself. This figure anchors obesity within the normative urban middle-class household and adds official backing to the idea that this household is a laboratory for the health of the nation, especially against the threat of fast food, which often moves in and out of these discourses. So, for example, in a protest of the opening of Kentucky Fried Chicken in Bangalore, one of the protest leaders pointed to the plump children of overseas Indians who grew up eating KFC. These overgrown kids look like broiler chickens themselves, he said. And here, the cultural figure of the non-resident Indian enacts a cautionary tale about the dangers of plasticity of the vernacular Indian body, which is not fed in a particular type of home kitchen. However, amidst these strong claims to comparisons, often in terms of excess and irony, there were also appeals to the metabolic idiosyncrasies of the Indian body. So yes, bodies in India were becoming comparable to those of the West, but some said this was happening through different mechanisms, unique to Indians, because of its histories of malnutrition. In order to estimate the seemingly sudden growth of diabetes and obesity, some experts formulated new diagnostic measures that accounted for the ways that Indians developed metabolic diseases at younger ages and at lower weight thresholds than populations in Western settings. And let me just say here for a minute that, as I go through some of the more biomedical stuff, there's an immense slippage between India, South Asia, and Asia that I never really could quite account for. So the body of the Indian stands in for South Asian and Asian, often in these discourses, and in efforts to sort of ask, how can you make a bodily measure national? How can someone who is Kashmiri be the same as someone who is Tamil? One is pointed towards a national body measurement. So I just want to sort of point out that slippage there. You'll see South Asian, Indian, and Asian a lot. The idea behind these new national measurements, however, were that Indians, even in times of plenty, were internally reconciling states of adequate or excess nutrition with a hereditary history of undernutrition, which again rarely has vernacular grounding. If globesity attunes us to the porosity of the body politic to new wealth, of a generalized whole to a generalized whole, what of the partial absorptions inside the body itself? The humble bathroom scale, a historical root of obsessions over obesity, and a torturous technology of truth, is one possible compositional starting point for this question. The domestication of the scale from public venues into homes was essential for mainstreaming the measurement of body weight, explains cultural historian Hillel Schwartz. Without the technology of measurement, he argues, the moralities affixed to body weight simply couldn't adhere. Measuring body weight has been a process woven into the most well-trodden paths of Mumbai, where scales operate at the intersection of curiosity and certainty. On street corners, men sit cross-legged behind bathroom scales with a cardboard square laid out in front, announcing the 1 rupee charge for the passerby to step on and weigh in. Train station scales are more elaborate, often printing body weight on one side of their readout slip and a fortune on the other. And this was one I got. I don't know if I was really 54, but it has a picture of Shah Rukh Khan on the other side. The guess your weight scale, I would argue, is actually one of the most ubiquitous features of Mumbai's local train system, and it mediates between entertainment and diagnosis. These scales, however, are slowly disappearing. Outside Mumbai's Glamour movie theater one day, I noticed that the usual guess your weight scale by the ticket line was gone, only to be replaced by a machine that purported to calculate body mass index, a simple calculation of metric weight over height squared. The machine looked similar to this scale, but its spin dials on its light on the front were gone, and in their place was a digital readout and a question printed in English: "Are you overweight?" In contrast to the playful ambiguity of train station scales, the body mass index machine suggested a certitude backed by science. This is clear to patients, as I observed time and time again in my clinical fieldwork, such as one instance when a patient welcomed the nutritionist in the clinic with a cheerful, "Ah, here comes my enemy." She had him get on the scale, which calculated weight and BMI. Its readout was 117 kilos, 258 pounds. He looked at it and began yelling, "This is wrong. Your machine is garbage. Throw it out. Seriously, I just weighed myself yesterday and it was 113. With patience and with pause, she said, smiling, "You must be putting something in your pockets," reminding us that playfulness inhabits fat's medicalization as well. Fun, however, was more the exception than the rule, I observed. The room for the nutrition consultation in my clinical fieldwork was cramped, with just enough space for the chairs and a table. The only other available space was taken up by a life-size cutout of an obese man, provided by the makers of the weight loss drug Xenical. The cutout had a built-in height measurement ruler, and at its base was an outlined area in which sat a bathroom scale. This was so a patient could measure her height and weight, or the nutritionist would measure her height and weight as well, to calculate her body mass index. The meter stick offered the directive, "Lose weight, gain life," and pasted over the man's heart was a clock, printed with the message, "Time is ticking." In my clinical observations, it seemed that a strikingly high number of overweight patients were women, due to thyroid disorders or polycystic ovarian disorder or PCOD, as much as type 2 diabetes, or what got called more generally overweight or obesity. One evening in the clinic, a 31-year-old woman named Mrs. Kadir sat quietly across from the nutritionist named Usha, who clicked her tongue as she looked over the woman's records, indicating that Mrs. Kadir's excess weight stemmed from PCOD. Usha solicited a meal-by-meal food intake recall and concluded afterwards that Mrs. Kadir didn't seem to be eating very much. Usha told her, "Don't skip meals. You're torturing your body, and the torture is lowering your metabolism." Mrs. Kadir expressed surprise at this conclusion. Actually, she said, "My body has been yo-yoing. Mera body yo-yo ho gaya." It goes up, it goes down. I'm afraid if I eat, my metabolism will go up the next day. I'm losing patience. After 3 months, I lost 3 kilos, and the doctor said that was good, but I didn't think it was good enough, so I just quit. Usha scolded her for her impatience and her ignorance. "You don't know what's happening inside you, do you? You should listen to me." From Usha's perspective, Mrs. Kadir simply couldn't understand the complexity of the metabolism. It was a closed hole, and should take a hint from medical authority. The metabolism could be mysterious to everyone, but Usha reinforced the point that as a nutritionist, the handling of this mystery was within her purview, as she governed what should go in and out of Mrs. Kadir's body. The coda in this conversation, like many I observed, was the BMI as a measurement of successful permeability and the need to scale its measures back down to the nutritionist's satisfaction. The calculation of the BMI itself was developed in the early 19th century by a Belgian mathematician named Adolphe Quetelet, who was tasked with estimating normal body size. Normal. For years, it was simply one of many possible anthropometric calculations, but by 1970, it was incorporated into the population and clinical sciences as a standard estimate of excess weight, beginning with a study of Norwegian children. Dr. Ansel Keys, who published a multi-country comparative study of obesity in 1972, gave the measurement the name body mass index, although he was using the same calculation as Quetelet did 150 years before. During the decades following Keys's study, the national institutions, like the National Institutes of Health, made the BMI into a standard measurement of obesity and used it to define thresholds for normal, borderline, and abnormal conditions of body weight. This authoritative tying of the BMI to definitions of individual obesity has proceeded even though Ansel Keys has written that, and did write before his death, that the BMI was not a useful individual diagnostic because it ignored any other variable besides weight and height. According to physicians I interviewed in Mumbai, BMI had been a very well-known but relatively incidental calculation for health until the late 1990s. For example, a doctor who started Mumbai's first weight loss clinic in the 1960s had long preferred to use body weight, bathroom scale style, as an indicator because it was easier for patients to understand and to track. In India's case, as a unique national BMI standard came into being in 2008, the calculation of the BMI also became a critique of Euro-American bodily indices. Hardly self-evident from the science, the BMI occupied a series of extensive debates among Indian biomedical experts to transform the threat of an ever-fattening Indian into a ratified, standardized bodily measure. Dr. Anup Mishra, one of India's most prominent metabolic disease physicians and who was integral to the ratification of the new measure, explained to me that in 1999, several epidemiological studies in Singapore and the UK among diasporic South Asians noted that in comparison to other ethnic groups, South Asians were developing diabetes, hypertension, and obesity at a BMI lower than the standard threshold for abnormal weight. They may have measured up as normal on the standard BMI scale, but their impaired metabolism suggested the inner workings of a body that was obese or diabetic. Something inside was not interlocking, not linear, not a smooth transition from one portal to the next. This apparent mismatch, and it often gets termed in discourses of mismatch, to point that out, prompted clinical studies in India, and soon the World Health Organization set up a special subcommittee called Obesity in Asia to investigate the issue, and this is where India stands in for Asia. In 2008, over 150 metabolic specialists and dietitians across India gathered for a consensus conference in Delhi, debated the scale for 2 days, and then publicly issued a recommendation for the country to use a new scale. On the new Indian scale, a person is considered overweight if her BMI is 23 in comparison to 25 internationally, and she is considered obese if her BMI is 25 as opposed to the international standard of 30. The official qualification for bariatric surgery also changed from the international standard of 35 down to 32 for Indians. I think this is long overdue, Dr. Mishra said to me, of the scale change. His team calculated that up to 15% of the adult population would now be newly considered overweight. This extra population, now considered overweight, was the centerpiece of media reactions to the new BMI scale. "You just got fatter," one news article announced, with the subheading, "What is overweight for Caucasians is now obese for Indians." Many of these articles quoted Dr. Mishra, who emphasized how new BMI guidelines would help identify at-risk individuals who would otherwise have gone unnoticed. One article suggested that overnight, 70 million more Indians became officially obese. Another pointed specifically to the racial geography of the scale, noting, quote, "If Western benchmarks tell you you're bordering on the obesity line, the Indian guidelines will prove you to be obese. Time to measure up, indeed." This shift to an Indian BMI was the result of years of discussion and research, as Dr. Mishra explained. But while these discussions about population-level measurements were underway, so too was a biological inquiry into the physiological conditions that make Indians different when it came to metabolic disease. This phenomenon is referred to often as the paradox of the thin-fat Indian. My clinical and biological research interlocutors would often point me to a photo published in The Lancet by two prominent endocrinologists, Dr. C.S. Yajnik from Pune and Dr. John Yudkin from London. The two scientists have the same BMI of 22.3, but Dr. Yudkin has a percentage of body fat of 9.1%, while Dr. Yajnik's body fat is 21.2%. And they also write in this article where they propose the theory of the thin-fat Indian that for Dr. Yajnik, who's on the right, the distribution of adipose, of fatness itself, is different than Dr. Yudnik, who comes to stand for Westernness more generally. I found the notion of the thin-fat Indian and its attendant claims quite striking. And to understand more, I went to Dr. Yajnik's research center at KEM Hospital in Pune. He explained that his research interests began in medical school, where he pored over American textbooks and began to think of Indian patients as very different in comparison to normal diabetic patients in the textbooks. Even at that time, in the 1970s, he was seeing diabetes among lower-income people and still does today. The hospital he was doing a rotation in had a ground-floor OBGYN center where low birth weight babies were born, and the diabetes center was on the 4th floor. He wondered what connected them besides mere elevators. His research team received funding from the Wellcome Trust to start a small study in rural Maharashtra that did intensive measurements, not just body weight, but also skin-fold caliper testing, and they found that Indian patients had more fat. And then this study has gone on to be a birth cohort. So year by year by year, they follow poor women in particular village cohorts in rural Maharashtra, and now they're following the children, and now they're getting ready to follow the grandchildren. So this is a long-term thing. Ultimately, what Dr. Yajnik and his colleagues argued for was the thin fat rationale, whereby across several socioeconomic strata, mothers gave birth to thin fat babies, meaning babies with birth weight, but ultimately became fat later in life. What they ultimately argued for internally was the sensitivity of the Indian body to specific kinds of triggers, its openness. He showed me photos on his computer of a clay potter whose wheel was set up just outside the hospital where we were sitting. It was the same clay, Dr. Yajnik explained, that was shaped into any number of different type of vessels, depending on the porosity of the clay to the frictive force of the potter's hands. So too was the metabolism similarly malleable. The answers, he said, are more complex than blaming the food industry or prescribing exercise. As I got up to leave, I noted that what was remarkable about his research was that he seemed to bridge discourses of under and over nutrition in India, which is often quite difficult to do in public health circles. One either sort of works on malnutrition or works on obesity. It's not a divide, he reminded me, it is a porous coexistence. Refrains such as time to measure up might suggest a power emanating from government health officials, impelling citizens to measure themselves against the new BMI scale. Perhaps one might even invoke discussions of the 19th century ethnographic survey of India and its anthropometric imperatives, wherein the measurement of the Indian body by colonial surveyors had both subtle and explicit effects on ideas about the natural division of populations, applied both within India and later within other British colonies. And to be sure, anthropometric measurements continue to be integral in demographic and health surveys, including the National Family Health Survey, which uses BMI for estimates of under and overweight respondents. But 23, the BMI of the overweight Indian, also anchors the diagnosis of the metabolic Indian and serves as a threshold of plasticity. If grids of absolute numbers structure anthropometry and the close-up caliper measurement of Dr. Don that goes onto the arm of the boy Shakarm, something additional is in play with the body mass index in India: the problem of plasticity, the problem of porosity, and the question of how to measure absorption of vital substances across the body's spectral past and fleshy present forms. So to conclude, historian of medicine Charles Rosenberg, in his essay The Tyranny of Diagnosis, points specifically to BMI as an example of the linkage work accomplished by a diagnostic technology. The body mass index, he writes, enables bureaucracy, market, cultural identity, and other factors to interact around the creation of an agreed-upon disease category and threshold. So for Rosenberg, the numbers of BMI communicate the spread of disease by quantifying comparative risk. I'd agree with Rosenberg, but I would add this. In light of the daily, deep-seated, and pervasive classificatory power of gender, caste, religion, and place of origin in India, simply attributing similar power to BMI would give it too much credit and would leave obesity as the unsurprising conclusion to the story of medicalization of new economy consumerism. So thus in this rendering, we not only get an inaccurate vector of power, but also a causal narrative in which fatness and pathology remain untroubled wholes and close relatives. This story doesn't begin to capture the striking plasticity of the gut and its metabolic effects in the world in terms of its potential absorptions, the ability for a person and a nation to be numerically thin and fat. Size-obsessed measures that are comparable of bodies, pleasures, and lives fail to fully account for chronic disease in India because they are moored in anxieties about consumption, the consumption of food, the consumption of fat, and the consumption of causes and consequences. Globesity is the materialization of fat bodies through addition, rather than through absorption. To compose obesity differently requires mapping visceral, partial entanglements of taste, harm, health, desire, and longevity, both on and through bodies. Katherine Malibu, in her book, What Should We Do With Our Brain, describes the brain, quote, not as the natural ideal of globalized economic, political, and social organization. It is rather, she says, the locus of an organic tension that is the basis of our history and our critical activity. I've suggested that this is also the case in the second brain of the body, the one residing in the belly. In scaling the thin-fat Indian, it is possible to find magnetism not only in the excesses of aspiration, but also in other bodily paths to pleasures and histories and other modes of causality and willpower in which time, geography, and harm are not foregone conclusions. It is possible, and indeed perhaps desirable, to push the scale past 23. Thanks.